We're back, season 2, a new studio and a new man in Washington. Hello, Sean Whelan.
Hello, Jackie. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's kind of like, I feel like Cilla Black. It's like, what's your name and where do you come from?
Where do I come from? I came from London, Jackie, and I left there on the day that Putin invaded Ukraine. That's when I set foot on US soil for my first day in this job as Washington correspondent. But my gear from London didn't arrive until the week before the UN General Assembly in September. So that was a long time waiting, about 7 months. Still only took 10 days for the ship to sail across the Atlantic, but getting ships and moving boxes. All those supply chain issues you've heard about, they're all true, Jackie. Things are still a bit chaotic trying to move things around the globe. The other thing I'm glad about now in Washington is it's the fall over here, or autumn as we call it.
Oh, such a beautiful time of year, isn't it?
The mosquitoes are... It's visually beautiful, but what I love about it most is the mosquitoes have died off and they're not biting me anymore. I was target number 1 for those guys. They're horrible, they're mean, and they're the nastiest mosquitoes I've ever come across on the globe. This place is a swamp. I wish somebody had drained it.
So you're adapting well then, I take it?
Apart from the mozzies, yeah, and now that I've got my Boris Johnson biography shipped across the Atlantic, yeah, I'm adapting really well. It's a nice town. I like it here.
Fantastic. Well, Sean, we have loads to talk about, so let's get to it. It's always good to do a refresher on these elections. It's a complicated process, and I think we can be forgiven for letting that information evaporate. Our foreign desk colleague Gail Conway is here to run through the foundations of the midterm elections. Hello, Gail, and
Hi,
thank you so much for joining us. So these midterm elections, they happen every 2 years.
That's right, Jackie. These are biennial elections. So like you said, they take place every 2 years. Now, elections are happening for Congress. Congress is made up of 2 parts, our chambers, the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. There are 100 senators and 435 representatives. So all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs, but senators sit for 6-year terms, which are staggered. So around 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. That means this year there are 35 seats up for election. So in the current Congress, women hold just over 1/4 of the 535 voting seats, and that's at 27%, the highest in US history. During the midterms, people won't just be voting for Congress. There are also a number of local and statewide races, including governors in 36 states. And this is important as some of these officials will be involved in organising the presidential elections in 2 years' time.
Gail, could you remind us about the importance of these 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate? What do they do in the US system?
OK, so in the House there are 212 Republicans and 220 Democrats, plus 3 vacancies at the moment, meaning Democrats have had control of the House for the first 2 years of President Joe Biden's term of office. So members of the House represent individual districts. The number of districts in each state is determined by a state's population, with each state having a minimum of 1 representative. Now, the House is the lower chamber of Congress, and it's responsible for passing federal legislation known as bills, and these bills then have to be passed by the Senate before being sent to the President for consideration. The House also has exclusive powers. It initiates all revenue bills, impeaches federal officers, and can elect the President if no candidate receives a majority of votes in the Electoral College. In recent years, we've seen the House start the impeachment process with former President Donald Trump twice, and the presiding officer is the Speaker of the House and is elected by the party that has more voting members. Currently, that's the Democrats, and the outgoing Speaker is Nancy Pelosi. So, quick fun fact, members of the House wear special pins. They identify them as members and distinguish them from staffers and visitors at the Capitol. So, unique new pins are designed for each new Congress every 2 years. Some female members have started wearing them as necklaces rather than as lapel pins.
We love a fun fact. So while the House is the lower chamber, then the Senate is the upper chamber.
That's right. So the Senate has the power to approve treaties, confirm major governmental roles, including the Supreme Court, cabinet positions and ambassadors, and conduct the trials of those impeached by the House. As we saw, they saved Donald Trump from impeachment twice. So Democrats currently control the Senate, but only with a 50-50 split, with Vice President Kamala Harris having the deciding vote. So usually 52 seats or more would be considered a true majority.
Thanks so much, Gail. We are definitely prepped and ready to go. Now, Sean, I don't know about you, but for me, my concept of time, it's all over the place following the pandemic. I can't believe it's only 2 years since Joe Biden was elected US president in one of the most controversial, divisive and most fraught elections. And 2 years since he was elected, it's midterms time. These midterm elections usually don't get the same attention as the presidential election. However, issues over the future of democracy, which we will cover in a separate podcast, by the way, mean tension is more focused than ever on these elections. Attention especially on the more local contests as they affect state policies on a range of issues, from abortion access to voting rights.
That's right, Jackie. It's a national contest, but it always breaks down to local issues because, as we know, all politics is local. And in certain states, well, in 4 states, in fact, this time we've got referendums effectively on abortion in the wake of what happened with the Roe v. Wade ruling being overturned by the Supreme Court back in May. We've also got, as always, you're going to get local issues related to the economy or particular environmental issues or questions of democracy. There are certain hotspots in this United States of America where the idea of election denialism or the notion that there was something seriously flawed about the way the election was conducted back in 2020 is very persistent and appears, in fact, to have grown in certain states. Arizona, a particular example of that. So, yeah, a lot of issues out there that affect the way the votes are going to fall. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is that even though there's 435 seats in play in these congressional elections, and every politician will tell you there's no such thing as a safe seat, there kind of is because of the way maps get drawn in constituencies here. Most of the seats that are being contested are not really being contested. Most of them are fairly safe seats. There's about 30, maybe 40 seats where there is a real contest, and that is going to be where the House is going to be won and lost. And the margins are pretty narrow. The Democrats only have a small majority in the House at the moment, and in a midterm election, it tends to be the party of the president gets a right old kicking, and if that proves to be the case, and history is repeated, then the Democrats look likely to lose this election. But the majority that the Republicans could get, it's not going to be a Boris Johnson-like landslide because of the way that only a few seats are really in contest. And it's the same in the Senate, but even more concentrated. But I think we'll talk about the Senate a little while away.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these midterm elections, as you were saying, they are usually a referendum on the president too, right? In usual midterms, the party in the White House suffers double-digit losses in the House, 26 on average since World War II, and around 4 Senate seats as voters seek to check on the president's power.
Yeah, and if that happens this time, then Joe Biden loses the House and the Senate because the majorities there are absolutely wafer thin. In fact, in the Senate, it breaks down to 50-50, and a casting vote of the chairman of the Senate, which is the Vice President Kamala Harris, keeps the Democrats in the slenderest of majorities in that House. And in the lower House, I think it's only 5-seat majority that they have there. So it's really, really fine margins here. Earlier in the year, around springtime, late spring, it looked like Joe Biden was going to get an almighty kicking because not only was he getting the usual midterm blues that all presidents suffer from, he was doing so in the face of one of the biggest economic downturns we've seen over the past 20, 30 years, really. The cost of living crisis hit home quite fast here. Inflation kicks in to the American economy, reflecting in prices on the shelves, in the petrol forecourts, very, very fast. And that was a dominant theme that was strapping booster rockets, if you like, to the unpopularity of the president earlier in the springtime. Now, he has had some positive news, things that have played to his advantage in the months since then. But the economy is the issue above all else in this election, and it's not playing well for President Biden.
And we had some gaffes as well from Joe Biden. I don't know if you remember that Where is Jackie incident. He apologised for mistakenly calling for the late Walorski during public remarks despite her death in August. Along with Joe Biden, Sean, Vice President Kamala Harris, she has also struggled with opinion polls. In her first year, she had a surprising amount of staff turnover. She was also tasked with two difficult jobs, tackling migration and enacting national voting reform, very difficult jobs. And at one point in 2021, her public approval rating sat at only 28%, making her one of the least popular vice presidents in modern history. That's lower than Iraq War architect Dick Cheney. That poll effectively framed the conversation about the vice president as one of struggle and also disappointment. For her boss, Joe Biden, would you believe he's 80 at the end of November, and he'll be hoping for a good result for his birthday present. And you talked about some of them there, Sean, but he did have some wins amid all of this unpopularity.
He did, and his wins came in the legislative process, so the House and the Senate. It's, as we know, the phrase gridlock is almost always bolted onto the word Washington. It's very difficult to get things through the parliamentary system here in the United States. Lots of presidents have tried and failed. It took decades to get a reform of the corporation tax law. They lagged, even though it's the ultimate in capitalist economies here in America. It took them decades to try and catch up with what everybody else was doing in the world. So it's hard to get business done. And yet, Joe Biden had this amazing run of getting bills, major pieces of legislation, through the House and the Senate in its coming up to the midsummer break. And that has given him something to start boasting about, getting this huge, big investment bill, Inflation Reduction Act, through. In particular, gives him something that he can go out and sell to people and say, look, I'm doing something to help you. He's also been trying to manipulate the fuel reserves here to try and get the price of petrol down. For a European, it looks fairly cheap, but for Americans, it's super expensive. And that's the one thing they are complaining about all of the time. Otherwise, the prices at the supermarket shelves, it's really hard to do anything about that, particularly in the short term. And you're at the mercy of the central bank, who are just putting up interest rates to do what they have to do in the face of inflation. It really doesn't help a president, though.
Absolutely. And with all of this in mind, what are the tactics of both parties during this election cycle?
Well, for the Republicans, it's straightforward. Everything that's wrong in your life, it's Joe Biden's fault. You blame him for everything. He's the guy sitting in the White House. We know where the buck stops. It stops with him. So you blame him for everything, particularly the economy, particularly for rising prices. Everybody is feeling the effect of rising prices, and it is really, really expensive over here. I got to say, Jackie, that's the one thing that I found really different. To
How much is your coffee in the morning, Sean?
To Europe. About £5.
Wow.
Pint of beer is £8 to £8.50. Plus, they're looking for a 20% tip on top of that. So it's tenner a pint is
wow.
Not unheard of.
That's more than Temple
Bar. You don't see much
Bar.
change out of a 50 if you're buying around. Yeah, a lot more than Temple Bar. And even Americans who've come over here in the summer have been shocked about how rapidly the prices have gone up and how high the prices are. My personal index is the onion index, $1.20 for a single onion down the supermarkets. And every supermarket in DC seems to be the same price. And of course, my final kicker on this one, when I arrived here, the dollar and the euro were pretty close in price. Now the dollar has strengthened because of the global economic and security situation. It's worth more than €1. So, $1.20 is more than €1.20 for a single onion. So the prices are pretty eye-watering. And
so
not just for me, but for everybody in this country.
So obviously then the Republicans, they're targeting Biden's unpopularity and the state of the economy, clearly, just by you talking there, the everyday prices. What are the Democrats doing then to go, hey, you should vote for us amid all of this uncertainty and high prices?
Well, the ones that they see as their bankers are the democracy issue, the threat to the democratic system in America caused by the election deniers and the work of the January 6th committee and everything that happened in that last presidential election and afterwards, and also the abortion issue. Now, when that happened back end of May, June, the Democrats were saying this is a big winning issue for us. Coming from an Irish background, I thought if a political party is nailing its colours to the abortion mast, then they're definitely in trouble. But actually, they were right. It has played out rather well for them. Some people were saying if the election had been held in early September, the Democrats would have done really, really well on the abortion issue. It's really mobilised a lot of women, particularly in the suburban areas, the key battlegrounds, in the key battleground states. And Joe Biden keeps going out there, even now, saying the power of women is going to be unleashed in this election, and the Republicans aren't going to know what hit them.
Yeah.
He might be right about that to some extent, but that issue of the economy has come back into fore during the month of October, in particular, late September into October, right up to where we are now. The economic news has just gotten worse and worse, and that's just playing badly for the Democrats. And the other issue the Republicans are hitting hard on is crime. They keep bashing into the Republicans, or to the Democrats, in any Democrat city, like New York or Chicago or LA. They are hammering home the crime statistics.
So with all of that in mind, Republicans remain favoured to take over the House in November. In the House, there are several races to look at, but we're going to park that for the next podcast when we look at American democracy, because that's whoever is elected to the House will have a say about the direction the country is going in. In the meantime, Sean, one race that Irish people will be interested in is the Massachusetts 1st Congressional District, as Richard Neal, a defender of the Good Friday Agreement following Brexit, is facing a Republican challenger, Dean Martilly. He's an ex-Democrat and pro-Trump candidate. So let's talk to the man himself. Chairman Richard Neal, thank you for joining us on States of Mind. It's a busy time for you with the midterms coming up, so we appreciate your time. You said this month that you have hopes that Democrats will maintain control of the House. How is that hope as we come closer to Election Day now?
Well, I think that when people look at generic polling, the question is a broad-based one based upon the appetite as to whether or not one would vote for a Democrat or a Republican. The challenge with that analysis is that it does not take into consideration the individual race. So I think that the candidates that we've had across the country have really been of high quality. And I think that the primary season on the Republican side created an atmosphere where there was a bit of a dilemma to go with the candidate who was the most fervent supporter of Donald Trump, which would be more problematic in a general election than it would be in a primary. It's going to inure to our benefit. So I feel very good about the quality of our candidates. And actually, when you trace a map and you go through it, I think our candidates in Michigan, in California, in Pennsylvania, they all seem at the moment to be in pretty decent condition.
As we come up to these elections, with all of that in mind, how do you look at your own country at the moment? Because from the outside looking in, it seems incredibly divided, tense, unpredictable, with an undercurrent of deceit. These elections seem to be highlighting those difficulties.
Well, I think that it's fair to say that America's in an irritable mood. I don't think there's much question about that. But not to miss the point that I think elections are about investing in our institutions and not investing in our personalities. So I still feel very good about America's institutions. I think that we've been through periods before which were far more, in upheaval than we are currently. And after all, we fought a civil war in the 1860s. We've had 2 world wars. We've had all kinds of dissent. And our First Amendment acknowledges the obligation of a second opinion. So I think that democracy is supposed to be noisy. And I don't think that I'm trying to understate the polarization that has now settled in with the American people. But I also feel very confident about our institutions.
Jackie, I'd be interested in hearing from Chairman Neal about his views on how he thinks the January 6th committee is playing as an issue in these elections with the electorate. Because most of the people we're talking to are talking about the economy. They're not talking about democracy issues or the findings of the J6 committee. Now, do you think, Chairman, is that because people are just being polite and they want to avoid this kind of civil war undercurrent, and so the economy is kind of safe ground for them to talk about? Or is January 6th just not having any real traction on these elections?
Well, I think that we're in the closing argument phase of the national campaigns, and the result of which is there's a combination of factors. I think January 6th is part of it. I think the economy is part of it. I think that the abortion argument is part of it. And I have to acknowledge that inflation is part of the argument as well. So the January 6th committee, in my judgment, they have performed a Herculean task, and that is using data and evidence to present and document their case. Facts, after all, matter. And I think that the manner in which they've conducted themselves as well has been superior to what those critics might have expected, when people thought that it was going to be more of a shouting match of he said, she said, they said. It has not turned out to be that at all. Instead, it has turned out to be a very well-informed inquest into what happened based on the result of January 6th.
And yet we're still seeing some people classified as election deniers still doing pretty well in the polls in their individual races. Do you think there's some parts of the country are just not receptive to the presentations from January 6th, and that the election denialism is so well entrenched in those places that they're more or less gone from a Democrat point of view?
Well, I certainly think there's a hangover effect. I don't think that's in dispute. And I also would suggest that I would use the example of New Hampshire, where the Republican candidate, Bolduc, made the argument for months in a Republican primary that Donald Trump had won the election. Primary, he said Joe Biden had won the election. So you can see that our primary system, in a sense, has distorted the realities of campaigning by suggesting that an individual has to stick to one position for the primary, and then they have to reverse course if they think that it benefits them by speaking to the broader audience, the general electorate that will go to the polls in November. So the primary system, I think you're correct, is distorting, for sure, our electioneering system. But I use the case of New Hampshire, where overnight an individual who had previously taken the position that Trump won then conceded the next day that Biden had won. And now Republicans, they're using a certain spin factor, which I find interesting. Rather than having to comment on the election itself, they are now saying Joe Biden is president.
Chairman Neal, just a bit of a gear change here, because you have been a massive defender of the Good Friday Agreement ever since the Brexit chaos from 2016. For you, what would a Republican House mean for US, Irish and UK relations?
Well, one of the nice things about the Friends of Ireland, which I've had the honor to chair and co-chair over many decades, is that it has always been bipartisan in nature. And I think that we are able to put aside some of the differences we've had to ensure not just the success of the Good Friday Agreement, but to also ensure what I believe is the argument that the Good Friday Agreement is a template for what peace accords can be like across the world. So I think the model we developed, the success that we've had, and I played a role in it, I believe remains really nonpartisan in nature.
So it would be business as usual if the Republicans took the House?
I think it would be business as usual, and you should know that I have been very careful over my long career on these issues that dates back almost to the Bobby Sands death to always make sure that this was bipartisan. So during my time as chairman and co-chairman, I carefully recruited Republican members of Congress who were interested in the issue, and we have a strong bipartisan committee.
Well, one final question from me, Chairman, if I may. Would you be brave enough now to put numbers on how you think the outcome is going to be for both House and Senate?
So let me give the mathematical equation. I think that there are about 38 seats that are to be contested, and I think that the winning side is likely to be up by slightly more than a handful of seats.
Chairman Richard Neal, thank you for joining us on States of Mind. I know you're on the road at the moment campaigning. It's in the middle of the midterm, so we really appreciate your time. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks, Sean. All the best.
All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Let's move to the Senate, Sean. That's more of a toss-up compared to the House of Representatives. Now, there are 50 senators from each party, with Vice President Kamala Harris having the tiebreaker vote there, as Gail was explaining to us earlier. So technically, the Democrats have the majority in the Senate. With this election, at least 8 races are considered competitive. Races to keep an eye on election night are Georgia, Nevada and Pennsylvania. In particular, Nevada and Georgia are ones to watch because that's where Democratic incumbents are seeking re-election. Sean, you were in Pennsylvania recently, though, and the Senate race there, you couldn't write it, you couldn't make it up. Pennsylvania is an open seat held by a retiring Republican and has been one of the most dramatic races in this cycle.
It has been dramatic, and I think it's going to be dramatic right up to the wire. You've got these two larger-than-life candidates. In the case of the Democrat candidate, John Fetterman, quite literally larger than life. The guy is well over 2 meters tall, about 130 kilos in weight. I mean, the guy is massive. If you think about the biggest lock, second row forward in rugby, and stuff a bunch of kilos onto him, a guy who's been hitting the donuts a bit too hard. He's bald-headed, he has a goatee beard, and he doesn't dress like a standard US politician. He goes around in hoodies and shorts most of the time. He has tattoos on his arms. I mean, the guy just absolutely does not look like a standard issue American politician. His rival, however, does look like a standard issue politician in the well-cut but not too fashionable type of suits, full head of hair, clean-shaven, rich dude, and yet he comes with his own backstory to him, because he is Dr. Mehmet Oz, best known in this country as a television doctor, goes by the name of Dr. Oz. He was the sort of in-house doctor on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and this brought him to national fame. And of course, fame is an absolutely essential bit of currency if you're coming into politics in America, as Donald Trump proved beyond all doubt. If you're famous, if you've got that name recognition, then you're going to pick up votes from people. So Dr. Oz comes in, well known nationally in this election, and endorsed rather late in the day by Donald Trump himself to give him that extra bit of perhaps fame or impetus that got him over the line in a rather tight primary race there to face Fetterman. And this looked like a great setup, a guy coming in from the Republican Party, from the right of the Republican Party, backed by Donald Trump, up against a guy who's fairly lefty in the Democrats and looks very left field. And it was all set up for a great titanic struggle until Fetterman had a stroke. And that left him out of the campaigning action for pretty much all of the summer. It was only in late August that he actually started to make a small comeback. But it's only in a small way, because the stroke has left him with hearing difficulties. He just can't hear a lot of stuff. People are saying things to him and he's just walking past them and they think he's being rude. It's not, he just can't hear it. He's had to do a television interview recently using closed caption, looking at the questions on a screen, and that is going to be difficult for him. He just can't communicate properly with the electorate. He's saying by January, by the time I take up my seat, I'm going to be fine again, but in the meantime he's got to come up against a fully functioning doctor whose specialism happens to be stroke and heart conditions.
It's just extraordinary stuff.
Whilst he himself has not, it is, and whilst he himself hasn't attacked Fetterman personally, his campaign people have, and he's run plenty of ads showing himself jogging along, looking super fit and healthy. The subliminal message there being, of course, you can trust me, I'll last the course, this other guy, not for the long haul at all.
It really has been some fight between them, because Pennsylvania is so important, especially when we look at presidential elections, because in 2016 Trump won Pennsylvania by only 44,000 votes. Then Joe Biden reclaimed the state in 2020, winning it by a similarly narrow margin of only 1.17%. And you were talking about some of the campaign strategies there, Sean. I think my favourite was because John Fetterman, for a bit of context, he is targeting Dr. Oz as being an opportunistic New Jersey carpetbagger. So he had Snooki. I don't know if you know what a Snooki is, Sean, or who a Snooki is, but she was a reality TV
High
star.
Court judge who said, "What is this Gaza? What is this Snooki?" I have no idea.
That's all right, we'll forgive you. But he had Snooki record, for people who do know who Snooki is, record a video reminding Dr. Oz that he's from Jersey, and he also flew a banner on the Jersey shore while Oz was visiting there that read, "Hey, Dr. Oz, welcome home to NJ." Mad stuff, it really is. Very briefly, Sean, any other notable Senate race mentions? Georgia is turning out to be another really unbelievable race, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, Georgia is unbelievable, and it's kind of down to cartoon capers there. You've got Raphael Warnock, who's a preacher, who is the preacher at the church founded by Martin Luther King, and is gained election there. So he's defending the seat. He's up against a guy called Herschel Walker, who is one of the most famous American football players ever to play the game of American football, won the Heisman Trophy, the College Player of the Year in his home state, Georgia, for Georgia University. Massively loved player as a footballer. Footballers transitioning into politics, some success, some not successful. But in Walker's case, he comes with a huge load of baggage in terms of his personal life, which is incredibly messy. He's trying to sell an anti-abortion message, and yet he's had a former girlfriend pop up and say, this guy paid for an abortion for me, and produced cards and stuff after he denied it. And then when he got deep into the denial, she came back out again and said, he tried to make me abort a second child. How can this happen? He's had 4 children acknowledged by 4 different women. He's been in trouble with guns and threatening people, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Some of his statements in his media outings have not been very edifying at all. And yet, he is within margin of error of this super slick preacher who can talk the talk on any given topic, as you'd expect of a preacher. They are really, really close. You can't separate them. And also to bear in mind with Georgia, whoever wins there has to get more than 50%. Now, neither of these 2 candidates have broken 50% in their polling, so there's a very good chance that this particular race is going to go to a runoff election in December. And if that is the one seat that is leaving the Senate in abeyance, and we don't know the result come a fortnight's time, then Georgia is most likely to be the place where we're left waiting for another month, and the attention of the nation is going to focus on these 2 guys. So keep a really close eye on that one.
Extraordinary stuff, and that's why we do this podcast. Arizona is also another race for listeners to keep an eye on when the midterms come up. More on that next week, because Sean, you are actually travelling to Arizona, aren't you?
That is the plan. Get down to one of the sunshine states and have a look at the sunshine. And now it's getting a bit autumnal here.
Very jealous.
I'm going in hunt of more mosquitoes. Hopefully there aren't any down there.
Though they'll love your Irish skin, I'll tell you that they will. That kicks the can into the next episode. So enjoy the hot October mosquito-ridden weather over there in Arizona, Sean. And I'll chat to you next week.
Will do, Jackie. Looking forward to it.